Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this afternoon's session. We all settled down? The next session is on the road to net zero and how the carbon market can contribute to decarbonisation. Just before we start, just a quick reminder that we're operating under Chatham House rules today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. My name is Louise Croucher. I'm an Executive Director at IncubEx here in London, and we are partners with EEX on all of the environmental products that the exchange offers. Unfortunately, two of our presenters are unable to join us in person today, but we've managed to record their presentations for us to watch, thanks to the wonders of modern technology. So I'd like to start the session by asking Dan Scarborough, who is here in person, to join us. Dan is the President and COO of IncubEx and was one of the founders of the company. He's been a leader in environmental and energy products for more than a decade and was Senior Vice President of the pioneering Chicago Climate Futures Exchange.
Thanks for that, Louise. Nice to be here with you all today. Dan Scarborough with IncubEx, as Louise mentioned. Been involved in the environmental markets now approaching 20 years, and we formed a partnership with the EEX group back in 2017, so about 5 years ago, to really help try to develop the environmental markets both in Europe, North America. There's a wholly owned subsidiary called Nodal Exchange in the US where we've launched a broad suite of environmental contracts in that period of time. I was asked to kind of step in today and talk a little bit about the history of voluntary carbon markets, and obviously I think everyone's seen the news and paying attention over the last 18 to 24 months. Over 5,000 companies making net zero commitments, much more focus on sustainability, investors really calling for viewing climate risk as part of your portfolio analysis when you're looking at really any investments in the space. So we've seen a fundamental shift in the markets, both public and private commitments. Public commitments being a lot of the voluntary initiatives, private commitments being a lot of the voluntary initiatives, and public commitments being a lot of the compliance markets coming online. So we've seen a vast expansion of cap and trade markets over the last 10 to 15 years. Obviously starting here with the EU ETS, you had the first multinational carbon trading program back in 2005. You had the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative go live in 2008 in the US, which was 10 states. Much of what's happened in the US over the last 10 to 15 years, as far as climate policy goes, has been very local or very regional, so state-based regional initiatives. California, under the Western Climate Initiative, started a cap and trade program for carbon back in 2013. And so there have been a lot of these markets emerging. Mexico, ETS, you have Japan, South Korea. These compliance markets are really developing quickly. The focus here today is really a lot about the voluntary carbon market. So just a few remarks about it. The voluntary carbon market is really not all that new. It's new to a lot of people who are just really coming into the space, and we've seen a big expansion of the number of participants and certainly the number of interested parties trying to learn about carbon offsets. But really, many of these methodologies and protocols go back 25, 30 years. And so these are, you look at a protocol that is on version 14 or 12, agricultural methane, land use. And really, generally, offsets fall into really what I would call one of four categories. You have avoidance or removal-based offsets, and they're either nature-based or technology-based. And that, generally you can fit virtually all the offset projects into one of those categories. At the moment, you have four major registries: Verra, the ACR, Climate Action Reserve, and the Gold Standard, where many of these offsets are issued. But really it's a twofold. I look at these offset registries as both a technology provider, where you have the issuance and tracking of the actual certificates, which is obviously an important part of the market infrastructure, but you also have the protocols themselves. And in many ways, this is the most important function that these offset registries are providing, developing the actual protocols that are setting the rules for issuing these carbon offsets. And much of the focus right now is on integrity of the voluntary carbon market, trying to bring legitimacy to the voluntary carbon market in many ways. But I look at it much in the way that I look at information technology security, a layered approach. So, very robust practices at the registries, very robust independent third-party verification by the verifiers. And then as the market develops from really over-the-counter bespoke markets into standardized, regulated, exchange-based trading, you then have another layer of security in the markets as well, because you have the financial market regulators that are taking a look at these markets. And so we're seeing a lot of this evolve before our eyes, but one thing I'd mention is that you look back to 2005, where you had really the first carbon futures contracts, that were issued for the EU ETS, EEX. At the time, Climate Exchange, we were working with the Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE. But really, offset futures were not that far behind. So you had the Certified Emission Reduction, or CER market, that came about 3 years later. You had voluntary offset futures that we launched at the Chicago Climate Exchange back in 2008. So there's a lot of talk about first offset futures contracts that are developing right now. I think we've seen a lot of that in the last 2 years, but in fact, they've been around for quite some time. There is significant innovation happening. This is just an indication of how long, one voluntary carbon market has been around since the early 2000s. Chicago Climate Exchange grew to almost 500 members. A cumulative emission baseline of 680 million tons were covered under that program, and it was a legally binding commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that was done voluntarily by many of these corporates: IBM, DuPont, Motorola, International Paper, 20 of the biggest utility companies in the US. It was a significant program. 150 million tons or so traded in the life of that program, which obviously if you look at the EU ETS, that's a very small portion of the volume traded in that market. But in terms of voluntary carbon, you had a weighted average price of $3.26 over that period of time as well. So, these are some of the offset protocols that were developed at Chicago Climate Exchange. Many of these are now in their version 15, or many new offset protocols have obviously emerged through these independent, generally speaking, non-for-profit registries. This slide is really just talking a little bit about the evolution of markets from over-the-counter, bespoke, very bilateral, every contract is negotiated individually, to standardized futures contracts. You're starting to see some of that emerge now with the likes of the CME offering, EEX group recently launching a broad suite of offset futures contracts, ICE launching a nature-based futures contracts. But really these serve a subset or sort of bucketed approach to certain offsets in the marketplace. Louise is actually here as well, and one of the innovations kind of moving towards the third bucket here would be more of a global standard, or really trying to create a benchmark, if you will, contract for offset contracts. So these kind of innovations are continuing to occur, and I'm sure Louise can, in Q&A, can talk a little bit more about the GER contract that has been designed. But these things are really evolving right before our eyes. So I'll leave it at that, but happy to answer any questions in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Right, we're now going to hopefully, virtually, hear from Margaret-Ann Splawn. She's a sustainability industry advocate for Microsoft and advises on carbon market developments. Margaret has many years of experience within the environmental markets, and she serves as a public-private partnership advisor, I practiced that last night, to Microsoft's $1 billion Climate Innovation Fund. She'll give a little bit more about her background in the presentation, hopefully. Here we go.
Hello and greetings from the Philippines. I so wish I could be there with you at the NED, and it's unfortunate that I've had to travel, but I'm excited to be here, but I'm also excited to be with you. And carbon markets have come a long way since I started as an EU ETS carbon trader back in 2012, when I worked with compliance entities to help risk manage their exposure. In 2013, I became an EEX qualified exchange trader back with Marianne Hawking, who is still with EEX, a dear friend of mine, and now currently a senior sales manager with EEX. So after this, I subsequently ran the daily participation of the EU ETX auctions for the company I was working with at the time, and I got to know several other EEX colleagues, including Christian Fletcher and others. What I'm trying to say is we've got a long history together, and so I thank EEX for your continued confidence by inviting me here today. And IncubEx is no stranger either, as Richard Wilson and I actually go back professionally to when we traded in capital markets. I traded carbon earnestly for well over 5 years, working with compliance industries across the EU. I've traded millions of tons of carbon allowances and offsets. I've set up sales tradings desks. I've built compliance and voluntary portfolios for a variety of entities. And what's interesting is the compliance and voluntary markets were largely siloed for a long time, but this is changing. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So now I work with Microsoft, so I'll be sharing the corporate buyer's perspective on carbon markets. I'll share a bit about how Microsoft is addressing these decarbonisation challenges within our own organization, and how we're applying what we've learned to help others too. Here's the agenda that I'll be covering: Microsoft's sustainability journey, how our work in carbon markets is contributing to our carbon negative goals, the results of our request for proposals in fiscal year 20 and 21 for carbon removals, what our carbon removal portfolio looks like, and some of the lessons that we learned in this process. So let's move on to the next slide. And let's jump in first with Microsoft's sustainability journey very briefly. Next slide, please. Now, this work isn't new to us. At Microsoft, we started our sustainability journey more than a decade ago. We've landed important work ever since we set our first carbon emissions reduction goal back in 2009. And we've made steady progress, but we realized that given the size of the planetary challenge, we needed to up our ambition. So in 2020, we made significant commitments to guide our environmental sustainability work over the next decade and beyond, actually, because we know that by 2030, society must be well on our way to mitigating and adapting to rapidly changing climates. So what we've done is we've committed to become a carbon negative, zero waste, water positive company by 2030 and build a planetary computer to help protect more than we use. And by 2050, we intend to remove all of our historic emissions since the company was founded back in 1975. At the same time, back in 2020, we created a $1 billion climate innovation fund for investments into carbon, water, waste, and ecosystems, and we pivoted our carbon strategy towards removals. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So the removal market is still nascent, and Microsoft is one of the first corporations to conduct due diligence on carbon removal procurement. In July 2020, we issued a request for proposal and received proposals representing 189 projects. We chose to purchase from 15 suppliers, representing more than 1.3 million metric tons of carbon removals. We based our choices on specific criteria, including clarity of carbon accounting, additionality, durability, potential leakage, and other environmental and social considerations. First of all, some perspective on our goals and actions over the last couple of years. We know that achieving our carbon negative goal by 2030 will require more than carbon reductions, although that is our priority. But we also need to remove physically carbon from the air. So we're committed also as well to reducing our value chain emissions by over 2030. However, to remove the residual hard to eliminate emissions, we estimate that we'll need to remove close to 5 million metric tons of carbon in 2030 annually, subsequently in years thereafter. So while the market might not be ready for this and is underdeveloped at this stage, we were one of the first corporations to conduct due diligence on the carbon removal market. So at the end of the day, in July 2020, on this RFP, we had 79 different applicants representing 189 different projects, and we procured through 15 different suppliers. For this particular RFP, more than 99% of the carbon removal volume we selected was from natural solutions, which means that we consider qualifies the durability of 100 years or less, such as forest and soil projects. In response to this RFP, more than a year later, we issued another one in 2021, and we had proposals from 67 different applicants representing approximately 106 projects in 35 countries. As you can see, this is significantly less than what we had in our first RFP. And we think this is a factor of having a clearer criteria. In 2021, the suppliers had a better idea of what we were doing with regards to what we were looking for. There was a better qualification of carbon removal versus carbon avoidance, despite there not being a common standards. And for this second cycle, we contracted a total of 1.5 million metric tons of removal credits from 21 projects, which met our fiscal year goal. Now, going forward, what we're doing is we're doing a rolling RFP, and this can be found on our website. Just type in Microsoft Carbon Removal Program. But let's move forward to the next slide if you can. And what we'll see is here's a visual form of what our two purchases look like from fiscal year 20 and 21. On both sides of the slide, there is a large circle, both showing over 1 million metric tons of reliance from forestry. Again, this highlights the reliance at the moment of low durability nature-based solutions. In terms of diving into these projects, some may be familiar, some others not. We've detailed each of these projects, their location, and how much we have purchased from them in our 2 carbon removal white papers, which can also be found on our website. Just type into the browser Microsoft Carbon Removal Program and you should find it. Our carbon removal procurement cycle, as I mentioned, is now open throughout the year, and you can review our criteria and projects to assess proposal eligibility. So let's move forward to our learnings in the next slide. So what did we learn? Well, we learned 3 main points. 1, we need to emphasize straightforward accounting of carbon removal. Our definition of net negative carbon removal project is one that is additional, makes defensible claims for the durability or permanence of its carbon sequestration, and appropriately accounts for any leakage. However, the market lacks strong common definitions and standards. We have developed and communicated our own criteria, and other companies, other corporate buyers have also done the same. But what this means is that organizations are working in isolation and tracking outcomes in different ways that cannot be easily compared. This leads not only to inefficiency, but to inconsistency in claims. Secondly, high durability solutions are critical. But supply is limited and really expensive in parts, and many companies cannot yet afford these at scale. So we need expensive, higher durability solutions to become more affordable. These could be surfaced by multi-year demand commitments, direct investments, and supportive policies that are all critical to driving costs down. At the same time, we are also open to projects outside the existing carbon market infrastructure. There are existing projects that have not been yet officially certified by registries, and we want to encourage their growth while staying rigorous to our own accounting and standards. And third, forestry and soil carbon removal face sobering challenges in quality, but offer short-term climate value and co-benefits beyond carbon removal. We assess projects based on their durability, that is to say, how long they guarantee that carbon stays out of the atmosphere. Challenges with nature-based solutions underline the fact that removal is not a uniform commodity that can be compared easily across project types. However, we believe that corporate support for nature-based carbon removal remains essential to the market developing. We have been taking critiques of nature-based solutions seriously and developed our own approaches to mitigating risk with these projects. So let's move on to our final slide, please. In conclusion, carbon markets are effective at reducing emissions on the broad market response to our RFPs indicated a need for standard definitions and thresholds of key removal concepts, such as additionality, leakage, and durability. Also, how to account for removals consistently across diverse project types, and how corporations can credibly claim credit for funding removal outcomes. Corporate buyers, NGOs, policymakers, and project developers should answer these questions together, and we want to be part and participate in shaping those conversations. Thank you so much for including us in this conversation today. Back over to you.
A great presentation. Okay, I'm glad that worked. So we're now going to hear from Ingo Ramming. Ingo is Head of Carbon Markets at BBVA in Madrid. He has many years of experience, and before BBVA, he worked at Commerzbank, Dresdner Kleinwerk, and Enron. Ingo was Deputy Head of the Supervisory Board of the Deutsche Börse Commodities, and he also co-chaired IETA's EU ETS working group. Again, he sends his apologies. He can't be here today, but he's also recorded a presentation for us to watch.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to the EEX Sustainability Conference. I'm very sad that I can't be in London for this seminar, but I'm grateful for EEX to be able to pre-record this short presentation. Climate change is one of the biggest challenges that we are facing. If you look at the heat and the drought during the summer, floods in other parts of the world, it is pretty clear that this is one of the biggest challenges. On the other side, if we look at the significant increase in energy prices, the social costs, the affordability of energy, and of course the question about competitiveness, it is clear that this is another reason to accelerate the green transition, to focus on clean, cheaper, and especially homegrown renewable energy sources. Banks play an important role in this transition by advising companies, by financing and facilitating this transition. Reversing climate change is the most urgent task for humanity. But, and as our head of sustainability always puts it, it is the greatest business opportunity in our lifetime. The world needs to spend 500 trillion on this until 2050, which is 5% of global GDP. This is the biggest investment in history. Next slide, please. BBVA is a founding member of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. With that, we commit to ensure that credit and investment portfolios are neutral and net zero by 2050. Committing to these targets requires that we act today, progressively aligning our portfolio with the goals of the Paris Agreement. We incorporate climate change risks in our risk analysis, our operating framework, and of course our business strategy. Part of this strategy is to assess, benchmark, and change. Next slide, please. The first part is to collect data, information, to be able to calculate the CO2 footprint, assess the current situation. The next step is about comparing these historically, comparing it with peers, benchmark it with best practice. And then, once we have done this, we can adjust processes, identify opportunities to reduce and/or remove greenhouse gas emissions. Here, the Science-Based Target Initiative, the SBTi, is playing an important role. Once this is achieved, and we have reduced greenhouse gas emissions, we might still have a small carbon footprint, small amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we can't remove at the moment. And here, voluntary carbon credits can play an important role when we want to commit to net zero, climate neutrality, or CO2 neutrality. The important point is here always the claim, so that we have a credible strategy, a credible claim, and avoid greenwashing. The work of the VCMI is important and can help companies with credible claims and how to use voluntary carbon credits. But of course, then the question is, what kind of carbon credit should I use? What is a high quality carbon credit? Here, the ICVCM, the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Market, is currently working on core carbon principles that define good credits, high quality carbon credits, a minimum threshold that needs to be achieved. Next slide, please. To have this base, this core carbon principle, is important because if you look at the current voluntary carbon market, then we have to assess that it's fragmented. Prices are very different, liquidity is limited, and we just miss commonly accepted quality criteria and standards. But this is important for future growth and therefore then as well for the success of the net zero journey. Next slide, please. We established our carbon market business in April. The aim is to support clients on their net zero journey, to complement our existing sustainable finance business. We believe that every company or financial institution is short carbon. This can be on back of regulatory requirements, for example, on back of the European Emissions Trading System, or driven by voluntary commitments. The requirements by banks or capital markets, by the public, or by customers. With the increased focus on Scope 3 emissions, supply chains are becoming increasingly important to drive and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and offset these unavoidable greenhouse gas emissions. For us as a bank, active in Europe, Latin America, and Turkey, carbon markets are an opportunity to match supply and demand, the net long companies with the net short companies, to bridge the gap between supply and demand. Support on the one side companies on their net zero journey to offset emissions that are not avoidable. And then on the other side, enable the establishment of offset projects. It is a global problem. And with this, we need to find a global solution. Carbon markets, regulatory and voluntary markets can play an important role to put a price on carbon, contribute to the decarbonisation. The role of exchanges is of course important. And they, like EEX, provide liquidity and transparency. Thank you very much.
Right. Cool. And finally, we do have someone else in the flesh here, in person. I'd like to introduce Lucian Unger, who works in the Business Development Environmental Markets team at EEX. Some of you may know him already. This team is working on building and developing both compliance and voluntary products for the exchange.
Welcome from my side, and thanks a lot for being here. What we're gonna do. We already heard two great examples how companies, one bank and one company, tackle their alignment to Paris goals. What is our commitment? What is our role as an exchange to fulfill the needs of our clients? We should be the platform, we should build a platform to simply help our clients to align with Paris goals, to fulfill their needs, to fulfill their requirements. Like our CEO, Peter Wright, said this morning, sustainability is in the DNA of EEX Group. It's simply close to our hearts. We are here to promote increased renewables in the European electricity market. For example, that we introduced long-term hedging possibilities in the power markets last year. We provide access to global carbon markets, and as well try and help our clients to decarbonize their own company. We do that by providing national, international, and also global carbon markets. What we do here, on a national level, for example, we introduced last year the German fuel ETS. It's especially heading for pressuring heat and transport sector to decarbonize their business. Just like that, we want to provide a market framework for this new emission compliance market, which could also be or lead to the expansion of the EU ETS as EU ETS 2. On an international level, we have a proven track record with the EU ETS operating the auctions, operating spot and the futures market. Since its beginning, with the auctions, we simply help our clients to fulfill their needs, their requirements for their compliance purposes. With our role as the common auction platform, on behalf of the 25 EU member states, we simply help as well the Innovation and Modernization Fund to get cash out of that and to also help and decarbonize and fund projects to help to fight against climate change. Besides that, where we have proven track record, where we have a lot of experience in the European market, we also heard, and it's glad that we have Dan here from the US, we also have our carbon markets in nodal exchange in the US. We have there also a proven track record over the last years with accelerating their open interest, with helping our clients there to overcome the quite fragmented framework, quite fragmented landscape of US carbon markets and to help to fulfill their needs on their side. Besides these markets we're operating in Europe and in the US, we're also looking beyond that, meaning, for example, we have the New Zealand ETS, we're providing there the auction platform for the New Zealand exchange, saying like this, we are not looking especially on our core market. We also want to contribute to help other markets out there to give them the opportunity to help and fulfill the requirements for cap and trade schemes around the world. Meaning like that, give a quite good example of the New Zealand ETS by having the auctions implemented from 2021 on, the price of this national ETS got up, and it was quite good to fulfill its role as a climate policy mechanism and to fulfill simply the need of giving pressure to the right sectors in the specific national market. Beyond these markets, we are also looking for corporations. We want to help with the proven track record, with the experience, to also build up other carbon markets worldwide. And one example is here China, where we recently had together with our mother firm, the Deutsche Börse, we were signing together MOUs to help also in China, to help give proven track record, building up a carbon market or helping to accelerate the carbon market there, to show that it is necessary, that we need robust markets to help and fight climate change. Our newest market, maybe that's also a quite good layer then coming over to our panel discussion, is the voluntary carbon market. So we introduced our first products in June this year at Nodal Exchange, again in the US. What is our goal here? We want to allow and we want to give clients the opportunity to offset their emission by purchasing carbon credits. Just like that, it is always a two-step approach. That's quite important to know, because in the first place, it's always about reducing your own emissions by doing own quite concrete measuring. In the second step, then you can offset your own hard-to-abate emissions by using carbon offset credits. And by doing that and acting with robust, trustful, and secure voluntary carbon markets, we want to give that to our clients. We want to give that with the suite of products we have to our clients by having a different set of products. Meaning like that, we have dedicated ones for CRCIA, we have one for nature-based, we have one also for removal, because removal as such is the only way, what is the big goal over Paris climate, it's the only way to go net zero as a company. And just like that, to fulfill our suit is simply also the GER, the Global Emission Reduction, and happy that Louise is here. That is simply a way also to go net zero by 2050 with high permanent technology-based carbon removals. By having all these different markets in together, by operating this platform, we want to help robust, we want to help also with quite secure and trustful, meaning like that we want to give our clients the opportunity to fulfill their needs, their requirements, to align with Paris goals. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucian. Right, I'm not sure we've got a huge amount of time, but there was one question I might just put Louis on the spot for. Just basically going to say, you know, obviously we're all speaking to many companies at the moment, and they're all on different paths to their net zero. I just wondered what you're hearing are their biggest challenges. Is it education? Is it access to market? Is it the reliability of the offsets? What sort of things are people saying to you?
Sure. So hi, I'm Louis Redshaw, and I'm here representing Net Zero Markets, but others may know me from our work at Redshaw Advisors. And our job is to help companies understand carbon markets, and we have been working with companies that have offsetting desires or requirements, and trying to assist them through the maze, the opacity that covers the voluntary carbon market. Until recently, there's been no transparency at all, actually, about prices in the VCM. And the issue that we keep coming across, we've had a great presentation from Microsoft, the world's largest software company, and they can have a dedicated team of people looking at this and running their own internal auctions, essentially, to procure removals. And the problem for the majority of companies is that they just don't have those resources. And so the majority of companies are actually not offsetting because it's just a bit too complicated. And I think that's the biggest issue that everyone has in the market is, I don't know what price I should pay because there's no transparency on price. I don't know what I should buy because people say renewables are bad, but other people say forestry is bad. And I'm being told I need to get to net zero. There's been a number of initiatives the last couple of years to scale the voluntary carbon market, but I honestly think the biggest impediment is that barrier to entry to the voluntary carbon market. You can go and find a consultant who'll sell you almost anything for almost any price, but what you don't know often is whether what you're buying is any good. We've sought to cut through that maze, and a little plug for the GER, the Global Emission Reduction. We take a little bit of the main types of carbon credits, so that's renewables and energy efficiency. It's RED Plus, and it's gold standard, so projects with sustainability development benefits. And we then add a little bit of sprinkling, if you like, of long-lived removals that no one can actually afford if they're in a competitive business to offset 100% of their emissions with, because at $100 a ton plus, it's just too expensive. So I noticed that Microsoft, more than 99% of their removals are short-lived removals. And we put in 1% today of long-lived removals, growing to 100% over time. The objective of the exercise is to make it simple, to make the choice just completely clear and not have to fear that you're going to be shot down by an NGO, that you've got a path to net zero, you've got a bit of everything. And the product itself is based on what the market, the voluntary carbon market, is actually retiring. So the mixture of those three components is determined not by us, but by what actually happens at retirement each year. So the issue is opacity and confusion. The answer, there's a number of different initiatives underway, and the answer will be will come out over time, I guess. The most
long
popular,
way to go, yeah.
The most popular product will survive. The ambition has to be getting everybody on board with the activity, and to do that, trust, transparency, consistency are absolutely key.
Great. Thank you, Louise. Sorry for dropping you in on that. I think, unfortunately, we're probably out of time. If anyone's got any particular questions, come and find any of us afterwards, and we'll be happy to help. And thank you all. Thank you for the panellists and the virtual ones. And thank you for your time. Enjoy lunch.